As we have mentioned on numerous occasions, the first part of the Old Testament is pretty easy to go through because it's just a series of biographies, right? Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and we just keep going from one person to the next. And all of that is interesting, and it is easy read, it's enjoyable reading. As you back away from all these biographies, tell me why you think the Lord put these here. What do we learn from all these biographies?
You can make mistakes as long as you do what's right, try to ask forgiveness.
Yeah.
God will forgive you.
Whenever we make mistakes, and everybody makes mistakes, right? Even Abraham, the father of the faithful, made some pretty serious mistakes, didn't he? And so we learn, something about what God wants from people, what pleases God, what displeases God, and that's important. Our faith actually is based on what we know about God's dealing in the past. That's the basis of our faith. Whenever our relationship to God and how we feel about God and what our relationship is based on what we know about His interaction with humans in the past. That's what our faith is based on. And what do we learn? We learn about men who are trying to serve God, and we learn about some who are not trying to serve God, and what the consequence of that is, right? I mean, you have Pharaoh as a pretty outstanding example of that. That God is going to accomplish His purpose with men with their approval or without their approval, right? And we also are learning that God has a plan from the very beginning, all the way from the garden, whenever He told Adam and Eve that the serpent was going to bruise the heel of his seed, and that his seed was going to stomp on the head of the serpent. And that's a thing that's going to go all the way through to the New Testament. Then we get to Abraham, and God gave Abraham 3 promises that provide a 3-point outline of the entire Bible. And the first promise was what?
A nation.
I'm going to make of your descendants a great nation of people. And that nation was whom?
Land.
Israel, right? The Jews, Hebrews, all synonymous children of Israel, all synonymous terms of Abraham's descendants. And then He made another promise to once they became a great nation. And where would you go in the Bible to demonstrate that God fulfilled that promise that He was going to make of Abraham's descendants a great nation? Everybody grab your notes, right?
Yep.
Exodus chapter 1, verse 7.
Yep.
Exodus 1, 7. So everything from Genesis 12 to Exodus chapter 1, verse 7 is the story of God creating from Abraham's descendants a great nation of people. And so we're about to get there, aren't we, in our daily study here. We're down to the last major Bible character before that happens. So by the time we get to the end of Genesis, what marks the end of the book of Genesis?
Death of Joseph.
Death of Joseph. So we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and their contemporaries that are in the book of Genesis. And then after Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, which says that talking about a new Pharaoh arose in Egypt that didn't know Joseph, and the people began to wax exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them, King James E's. And so they became a great nation of people. And after that, the second promise that God gave to Abraham, which the second point outline is what?
Land.
He's going to give that nation of people a land. What characters are involved in the fulfillment of that promise? Moses,
Joshua.
Joshua. Moses and Joshua. And that goes all the way from the beginning of the book of Exodus to the end of the book of Joshua. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua are the story of God giving that nation of people a land. And Joshua chapter 21 verse 43 through 45 says God gave them the land.
Didn't happen overnight though, did it?
Pardon?
Didn't happen
It
overnight.
didn't happen overnight. It didn't. In fact, not very many things that God does happen overnight, does it? That's one of the things we learn too. Don't get too impatient. God's working. God's working.
And sometimes his discipline is swift.
It is, yeah, well, usually after warning, it'll come. Yeah, it'll come. And another thing we learn from the Old Testament, we learn about what you just said. God is a loving God, but he's also a just God, and
Right.
he's also righteous. And that righteousness demands that sin be punished, and it will be. So then you come to the fact that they inherit the land, and there's one more promise to be fulfilled that God gave to Abraham, and that was what?
Son.
Seed.
Through your seed, all nations of earth will be blessed. And that seed is
Christ.
Jesus Christ. How do we know that? Where would you go to demonstrate that?
Galatians
Galatians
3:16.
3:16. When God said to Abraham, unto thy seed, he said he did not say unto your seeds, meaning many people, but unto thy seed, which is Christ. So that's a 3-point outline of the whole Bible. And as you get that overarching picture, you know that from the very beginning, God is in control. God is going to work his plan through this world. That's a good thing to know. Because at any given time in history, we can, if you were just to stop at any given time, it very well might look like God's not in control, right? That's the book of Revelation, by the way. You got some horrible things going on, and it looks like God's not in control, but God is in control. And sometimes God allows people individually and collectively as a nation to continue on a path until their cup of iniquity is full. And then he brings the hammer down. But
You think all this stuff is is according to his plan? The people rebelling and all that kind of stuff, or?
no, it's not according to his plan, but God knows. You know, it's like, I don't know how good a parallel is, but whenever you're rearing children and you rear one or two and they get involved in something, then you know how this is gonna turn out, right? And sometimes, if they're not gonna be really injured badly, you might let them find out for themselves. You tell them what's gonna happen, but if they insist on doing it, then you might let them find out for themselves. And, but anyway, there are lots and lots of lessons that we could just keep talking about that we learn from God. And basically, the Old Testament is not a story about great men. It's a story about a great God.
Amen.
Who can use really, really weak men to accomplish his purpose. So,
You can also learn that even when you do the right thing, sometimes you gotta suffer for it.
that's right. You're right. Exactly. In fact, the story that we're in right now would be a classic illustration of that, right? That even when you do the right thing, sometimes there's gonna be a price to be paid for it. Sometimes it's gonna be serious. And so we're in the life of who right now? Joseph. We're in Joseph's life. And we had an interlude in chapter 38 where there were some family problems with Judah, right? And a prostitute. And now in chapter 39, in the end of chapter 38, you had 2 children that were born as a result of Judah's indiscretion. Perez and Zerah in chapter 38, verse 29 and 30. And then when that happens, when you're in that delivery room and you see those 2 boys being born, and you see, you got that information, then the curtain comes down, the screen goes black, all right, or it fades out. Then when it reopens in chapter 39, where are we? We're back in Egypt, and we're back looking at Joseph. And when we left Joseph, when the curtain came down in chapter 37, tell me where Joseph was at that time. Yeah, we're just told that he's been brought as a slave by whom? Okay, by Potiphar. Who brought it, who sold him, who bought him and sold him? Ishmaelites, right? The Ishmaelites. And so they sold him as a slave into Egypt, and he ends up at Potiphar's house. And then the curtain comes down, and we have the interlude of chapter 38. Now the curtain comes back up, the stage is reset, we're back. Joseph is in Potiphar's house, and verses 2 through 6 tells about how he advanced. Now think about, how old is he, by the way? 17 years old. 17 years old. All right, you got that picture? Think of some boy you know, young man you know right now that's
Eva's
17
age.
years old. Pardon?
Eva's age.
Eva's age.
Yeah, 17.
17 years old.
Cultivate.
And so, he's sold, Potiphar buys him, and Potiphar is who? He's the captain of the guard. Captain of the guard in Pharaoh's house. So he's a really, really important man. He's a 5-star general, all right? And he's used to people hopping when he says hop, right? And so he buys this young slave boy, and verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. I'm in chapter 39, verse 2. He was prosperous. His master, verse 33, saw that the Lord was with him. The Lord made all that he did prosper. He found grace in his sight. He served him, and he made him overseer over his house and all that he had put in his hand. So he gave him a lot of responsibility, everything to do with his household. He was busy in the military, right, taking care of Pharaoh with his men. And so he put him in charge of everything about his house. And it says, verse 5, it came to pass from the time he made him overseer in his house over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. So he made a wise decision in putting him in charge, right? And it says, the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the field. He left all he had in Joseph's hand. He knew not anything that he had. He didn't even keep up with his books. He let Joseph take care of his finances and everything about it, except the bread that he ate. He decided what he wanted to eat for supper every night. All right? He put that order in. It says in the last part of verse 6, somebody read it from something other than King James about Joseph.
6.
Yeah. 39:6. Joseph was.
So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat.
And Joseph, no, the next part.
Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully.
Okay, so you got a picture of him. You know, I'm not gonna name any names, but you think the 17-year-old boy that's pretty well built, he's good looking, and he, all the ladies, whenever he passes by, he catches their eye. And so here he is, and Potiphar's wife sees him every day, and she decides, you know, my husband's gone all day long. You know, what's a little hanky-panky here? You know, so she decides, verse 8, but he refused, and what was his reason for refusing? What did he say?
His master trusted him.
Yeah, said he's trusted me with everything in his whole life, except you. He has withheld nothing from me except you. And so I'm not going to sin against him. But verse 10, and by the way, he says, how can I do this wickedness against God, in the last part of verse 9. So it wasn't just his master he had in mind. And by the way, if you stop and think about that, that's how you make good decisions in life. How is this going to affect me? How is it going to affect other people around me? And how is it going to affect my relationship to God? And if you'll take those things into consideration, you'll make good decisions in your life. But any one of those that you ignore is gonna mean you're gonna make a poor decision. So, that's a pretty good, that's a sermon, that's how preachers get sermons, by the way, come up with, that kind of thing. In verse 10, it came to pass as he spoke, as she spoke to him day after day. She wouldn't give up. She just kept on and kept on. He wouldn't listen to her. He wouldn't lie about her or be even near her. He stayed away from her.
I think it's
You know-
interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think it's interesting, though, that in spite of all that's happened to him so far, first he finds out they're gonna kill him, then they don't kill him, they sell him into slavery. And he still, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?
Yeah, I know.
And at this point, he doesn't know that God has a plan for him here.
Among my very top line heroes in the Bible is this young man.
That's right.
I mean, 17 years old, all right? And he's, how's he been treated by his family, I mean, he knows his father loves him, but his brothers have sold him into slavery, and he's halfway around the world as far as he's concerned, no way to get home. And he's felt the loneliness and hurt, being rejected by everything that he knew. He's in a place with a foreign language, he's had to learn another language, completely different culture, everything associated with it. And when you're 17 years old and you're a long ways from home, and there's a good-looking woman that comes on to you, it's a real temptation.
Right.
And
But
so,
she could have been ugly.
pardon?
She could have been
I
ugly.
doubt it. If she was, she had all this stuff to make her pretty, because they had plenty of money, all right? But I bet she wasn't, but I don't know. But anyway, a lesser person would have succumbed to the temptation. So, and you know what happens next, right? She was so insistent that she one day just reached out and grabbed him and said, "Come to bed with me." And he pulled away from her. When he did, he pulled away so hard that she had such a firm grip on his coat that it came off. And so she decided, okay, if he's not gonna cooperate with me, I'm gonna make him pay. Hell hath no fury like
Storm.
yeah. So she cries rape. And there's one interesting thing about when somebody cries rape, you can't disprove it. If you're the guy that's accused, you have no way on the face of this earth to disprove it. I mean, we see that kind of stuff today. People are coming out of the closet, women are coming out of the closet from things that happened 30 years ago. How do you disprove it? So, anyway, when her husband comes home, she has concocted this story, and she tells him the story about how this young slave boy that you brought in here tried to rape me. And he would have if I hadn't cried loud enough, and I could look here, whenever he ran away, well, I got his coat. And he ran away because I screamed. And so her husband obviously was convinced about this, and he's a military guy, and so, he just cold hard facts, what rules for him, and so.
He probably didn't want to believe it, but he had no choice.
Yeah,
I wonder-
maybe.
I wonder if he did believe all of it, because why didn't he just have him killed? He was his servant.
Yeah, he was what?
He was his servant.
Yeah, he was, and he had a lot of power.
He could have killed him
Yeah, a lot of
probably.
power.
Why didn't he just have him killed?
Yeah, we can speculate about it, it could be, I thought the same thing, that if, you're living at that time, and, it was not unusual, for somebody to be executed, then, somebody raped your wife, what are you gonna do if they're your slave? But anyway, maybe he knew his wife too.
I was gonna say.
So,
That's one of the
Maybe this
first
wasn't the
times.
first time she tried something like that.
Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, something happened. We don't know all the facts about it, but it's kind of interesting. I mean, you put yourself there and, try to envision, put yourself in each person's place, and the main character here is Joseph. Now, think about what happened to him with his family. and his brothers, and they sold him. And you know he begged them not to do that. You know that he pleaded as they were carrying him away captive, and they had sold him for money, a little bit of money. And he's looking back over his shoulder, and there his brothers are, they're all counting the money that they got from him, dividing the money up. And then all that happens to him, you know, whenever he makes that trip to Egypt, and then he's sold in this completely strange situation, and then things perk up, you know, some good fortune comes his way. And then all of a sudden, just like that first time, you know, he totally didn't deserve what happened to him. In fact, as you said, sometimes you learn that doing the right thing, you pay a pretty serious price for it, don't you? And so he did. What happened to him?
He gets
Throw him in prison.
Put him in prison, where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison, verse 20. And I don't know if that was a better or worse place than the normal jail. I don't know. What, you know, maybe it was in somewhere in the palace, you know, the dungeon of the palace where it was, I don't know. But it says there in verse 21, the Lord was with him, gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So the head guy in the prison saw him and saw that he was an honest guy, that he had integrity. I don't know what all he did. Maybe he saw him helping other prisoners or something, I don't know, but whatever he observed him and said, hey, this kid is not like all the rest of these prisoners in there, you know. And so he put him in charge. And verse 23, the keeper of the prison did not look to anything that was under his hand, because everything that Joseph did prospered. So some good fortune, if you can call it good fortune, being in jail, you know, I mean, it's better than being hung up and lashed. So he's now given a position of responsibility again. And in chapter 40 now, and as you think about, I mean, I see this thing almost in the scene of a play. Okay, here he is, and he's been elevated to this position of responsibility. And one day the doors open and the guards bring in two guys. And they're a little different than most of the prisoners. I mean, they're dressed pretty nicely. They're evidently important people. These are white collar guys that are coming in this time, all right? And one of them is a baker and the other one is the butler for the king. And they've done something. I don't know what the two of them conspired to do, or you know, what they didn't do that offended the king, but he had them thrown into prison. And he said he was the chief of the butlers and the chief of the bakers. So they were the head guys. All right? And to be either one of those was a position of tremendous responsibility. Because if one of them's taking care of what he drinks, the other taking care of what he eats, and kings were very, very cautious about what they ate and what they drank. And so they had to have people that were trustworthy in those positions. They had to believe they weren't going to poison them, right? And so he put them in a ward in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison and the place where Joseph was bound. So he got put into that section of the prison where Joseph was. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. And I don't know what he told them to do with them, but he said, hey, you got these two guys that come in here. Here's what they did. Here's why they're in prison. I want you to do what needs to be done. I don't know if it was take care of their food or if they were treated specially, or I don't know what that was. But now what's going to happen? As we're watching this movie, what's going to happen? They're going to have dreams. Both of them, the butler and the baker, are going to have dreams. And you're going to see it on the screen, you know, and it's going to come up, and it's they're asleep, and one of them has this dream, and the other one's asleep over here, and he has this dream. And so when they wake up from their dreams, they're really concerned about those dreams.
I think it's interesting that Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and said, and saw that they were sad. He knew them well enough to know that something was troubling them. He wanted to know what it was. He obviously cared about the prisoners.
Yeah, and they probably, the two of them must have been in the cell together or an area together, whatever, and they had discussed the fact You know, he said, one of them woke up and said, man, I had this horrible dream last night. And he tells another, said, well, let me tell you about the dream I had, you know. And by the way, one of them was a lot worse than the other one, right? But anyway, so in verse 9, 10, and 11, they tell Joseph their dream, and the butler had a dream of what?
But mine,
Yeah, vine that had grapes on it, and he squeezed the grapes into a cup and he served it to the king, right? And the baker had another dream. His dream was what?
3 cakes and baskets.
Yeah, he had a basket of bread.
The birds were eating.
Birds came down and were picking that bread. Not a good omen, right? So Joseph interprets dreams very specifically, and he says to the interpretation of the butler in verse 12, 3 branches are 3 days. So this is on the money. 3 days from now, here's what's going to happen. Pharaoh is going to, and the King James uses this interesting, it's going to lift up your head. Sometimes that means a good thing, and sometimes that doesn't mean a good thing. Sometimes your head is lifted up and it's not good, right? But sometimes it's good. But he notices him and he, pulls him up for attention. And he says, you're going to deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand. And then he says to him, when that happens to you, what? Remember me. Remember me. Because I'm here for, I'm innocent. Of course, everybody in jail said they're innocent, right? But he was. He was innocent. And so he said, here's what happened to me. I was sold as a slave, verse 15, and so I'm interpreting these dreams for you. So whenever you are back in your position again, and you're serving Pharaoh, would you remember me? Would you put in a good word for me? And so I'm sure he promises you that he would. But what do we know about that?
He forgot.
He conveniently forgets it. Do you know how long he forgot it?
2
2
years.
years.
2 years. You think he forgot it? I don't think he forgot it. I think he's just decided, why should I put myself in a position, I may make him mad again, if I put in a good word for this kid down there. So, and then the baker, he's pretty encouraged by this interpretation of his dream. So he said, well, let me tell you my dream. So he tells him his dream, and the interpretation of it is what? 3 days from now, something's going to happen to you too. Pharaoh is going to lift up your head. But guess what?
Don't stick
It's
it on
not
a
going to
stick.
be good. It's not going to be good. And it says, verse 19, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off thee. He's going to take your head off. Not just going to lift it up. And he will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from off of you.
My version says, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head.
Yeah, that's what mine said. From off thee, yeah. The other one said he lifted up. This was going to lift it off. Yeah. And he's going to hang him on a tree. And the birds will.
Wonder what he did to get involved like that.
Yeah. By the way, sometimes when we think of being hung on a tree, we think of a hangman's rope. That's not always what that means. Sometimes it means that there's a sharp stake, and they pick you up and they run you down on the stake.
Impaled.
Yeah, and that was quite often what happened by the Romans too, by the way. They did execute on the cross, but they also, the Assyrians did the same thing. They would impale you on a stake.
Who was the king and impaled them and he put them on fire to use them for light?
Nero.
Nero.
Nero. Yes, he did.
The Philistines did it too.
Do what?
Philistines did that to,
Well, that was what happened to Naaman. Not Naaman,
And
I mean, what's his
Haman.
name? Haman, yeah.
Saul.
So, verse 21, well, verse 20 says, it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. So he's gonna have a birthday celebration. Kind of interesting birthday day, right? He made a feast, and he remembered all that good stuff, all those sweet bread and cinnamon rolls that baker could make, so he called him back up again. But evidently, the butler must have done something a little more serious than whatever the baker was. And he restored the chief butler to his butlership, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged, I've got it backwards. Yeah. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted. Yet, the chief butler did not remember Joseph or forget him. So, in our scenario here, we're seeing these dreams being fulfilled, and as we see the butler taking the cup to the king, then the curtain comes down. All right. Now, 2 years. You have this little scene, 2 years later. Okay, curtain comes up. Pharaoh has a dream, and we know what that is, right? What's his dream? It has actually the same dream that is depicted in 2 different ways, right? First dream is what? About the cows.
Fat cows.
Right? So there were some skinny cows, and have you seen really, really bad cows that were really, really skinny and their ribs poked out and all that kind of thing? Well, there was some of them on the bank of the Nile, and or there was fat cows, right, on the bank of the Nile.
Yeah, no.
And while they were eating and everything was really good, and out of the Nile came these skinny cows. That's pretty spooky, by the way. You think of those cows coming up out of the water out of the Nile, and they come up and do what?
They ate big cows.
Eat the fat ones.
Yeah, now cows are not, they're not meat eaters, are they? But these cows were.
Carnivorous.
And so if you get a cow that's a meat eater, you don't wanna mess with that cow. So these cows come up and, that had to be a very distressing dream, to watch those skinny cows eat the fat cows, right? I mean, just think of how gory that was. These fat cows are grazing along and everything's wonderful, and they look up and all of a sudden here come these monster cows, coming. And so, he went to sleep and it troubled him. But he dreamed, verse 5, a second time, and then there were 7 good plump ears of corn, and then 7 thin ears came blowing out of the east, it says, and they devoured. That corn ate up fat corn. And guess what? It didn't get any fatter. It still was skinny, wasn't it? And so Pharaoh woke, and that was a dream, and so he was so concerned about it that he called all of his people in, his smart people in, and told them what the dream was, and nobody could interpret it. And so he was angry with his servants, and
Magicians.
yeah, they couldn't interpret the dream. And in verse 9, the chief butler said, "Oh, yes, I remember.
I remember my faults
Yeah,
these days.
I remember. And now it is to his advantage, right? It wasn't, he didn't know if it would be to his advantage to do that. It wasn't gonna be any benefit to him to put in a good word for that boy down in prison. By the way, how old is this young man now?
19.
He's about 19 years old, all right? And so he remembers him, and he speaks to him. And he said, "Sir, do you remember back a couple years ago when you got mad at me and you put me in prison? Well, while I was in prison, I had this crazy dream." And he told him what the dream was. And he said, "And your baker also had a dream. And there was this kid down there that interpreted our dreams exactly, they came to pass exactly like he said they would come to pass." And he said, so evidently he has the ability to interpret dreams. So you might wanna call him and bring him up, lift his head up out of prison. So they send word to the captain of the guard. He was, verse 12, he was a servant to the captain of the guard, and said, when he restored me to my office, and he hanged the baker. And so Pharaoh sent to him, and says he shaved himself and changed his clothes, and I'm sure he took a bath, and he got himself presentable. And when he presents himself before Pharaoh, you know, I wonder what they told him, if they told him why he was being called up. But I mean, the fact that they gave him some good clothes and told him to shave and clean up and so forth, I guess he would probably assume that maybe something
They weren't
good.
gonna waste it on if he was gonna hang him, huh?
Yeah, that'd be what I would think, you know, I mean, they'd just drag him out somewhere and take care of that. So he tells him his dream in verse 15, and he said, nobody here can interpret it. And Joseph said, well, I can't either, but I know somebody that can. And so, Pharaoh tells him, what his dream is about the cows and the 7 ears of corn from verse 17 down to verse 24. And then, verse 25, Joseph says, well, you've had 2 dreams, but they're the same, they mean the same thing. There's gonna be 7 years of incredible prosperity here in your kingdom. And that's gonna be followed immediately by 7 years of famine. And so, as you think about that, you think about those cows that came up and ate the fat cows. That's a pretty gory, grisly scene, but it's not as bad as what really happened, right? I mean, when your food runs out, and for 7 years, can you imagine, as independent and prosperous as we think this country is, if for 7 years there were no crops? I don't care how powerful you are. I don't care, you know, how strong a nation you think you are. You're coming to your knees. And so, you think about what would have happened if God had not sent these dreams and sent Joseph to interpret them and so forth. What would have happened to not just the people in Egypt, because we found out that famine also was down in Canaan, wasn't it? There would have been thousands and thousands of people that would have starved to death, that would have died. And the desperation that would come after 3 or 4 years of not having a crop, and the crime that would come, and all the kind of things associated with that.
Those all the animals would die too.
Animals would die, that's right. I mean, you'd keep them alive as long as you could, but when it came down to whether they got something to eat or whether I did, well, you know, I'm gonna eat the cows, you know, even if they are thin. So, he tells them the 7 years are gonna be, 7 years that follow the years of plenty are going to be 7 years of famine. So, and he tells him what that means, verse 28 through 31. And verse 32, he tells him, he says, this is absolutely going to happen. That's why you had that dream twice. It came in 2 different ways. Because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So now, Pharaoh brings his wise people in. They're probably standing around, at least the elite of them are, and they hear what's going on. And so Pharaoh calls his council together, and he said, okay, I believe this kid. You know, we've got proof that he can interpret dreams, and this makes a lot of sense, what he just said. So what are we gonna do? And they decided, okay, we need to lay up corn for these 7 years so that we can prepare for the famine that's coming. And they said, well, this is good, but we need to find somebody that can supervise this whole thing. And who do we have here? Give me your suggestions of who can supervise this. And so, they probably look at this kid over here, about 19 or 20 years old. They say, you know what? I believe he's the guy that can do this. Now, you think of the task, you think of the enormity of Egypt and taking all of the money, taking all of the produce, or the big portion of it, and storing it up. And
Storing
building
what?
granaries for it, pardon?
Stored in what?
Yeah, they're gonna have to build granaries for it, they're gonna have to have people supervise it, they're gonna have to have it taken care of so that the bugs don't eat it, and on, because it's quite a job.
Don't you think that probably was it the butler? The butler, when he tells him about the dream, may have told him how he was when he was in the jail too, you know, that he ran to jail and was,
Yeah, well, he did.
He was very wise and
Yeah,
prudent and
He
everything.
said he was, the chief of the jail that put him in command of everything.
yeah, so, I mean, he was only 17 then, so it was pretty
Yeah.
impressive that he could run a jail at 17.
And so Pharaoh calls him and says, verse 39, you're the man for the job, all right? And so I'm gonna put you over my house according to your word. Whatever you say is what my people are going to do. So I'm putting you in command. Here's my signet ring. Whatever you say goes. Now, let's just say 19 or 20 years old. Greatest nation to this point in history that has ever been. Egypt. Incredibly rich. Lots of natural resources. All the other nations look to Egypt as the premier nation. And so now he's set over that nation. And can you imagine, talk about, I won't say from rags to riches, but from, you know, a young man.
Bondage to riches.
Yeah, the riches here. And so he said, there won't be anybody greater than you, verse 40. So they set you over the entire land of Egypt. He took his signet ring from off his hand. He gave it to him. He gave him some fine clothes and a gold chain to put on his neck. He would ride in the second chariot, and men would run before him and tell people to bow down whenever he came. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Now 20 years old, slave boy.
Yeah, yesterday he was in prison.
Yeah.
What Potiphar thinks now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I just wonder what he might have had to say to that butler too, by the way.
Yeah, me too, I've wondered about
2
that.
years. Hey,
Thanks for
it's been
that.
2 years.
Yeah.
But, so Pharaoh, verse 44 said, I'm Pharaoh, but without you, nobody will lift his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. Nobody will do anything without your permission. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
In verse 38, it says that Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone such as this man, a man who is the Spirit of God? So he
Yeah.
did
In whom the
recognize,
Spirit of God, yeah.
he gave God credit and
That's right.
Pharaoh acknowledges it.
So, let's end here in verse 45. Pharaoh called Joseph's name something or other.
Yeah.
Zaphnath-Paneah. Do you have a footnote tells you what that means? Savior of the world.
Really?
Savior of the world. Isn't that something? So by the way, he is a type of Jesus.
Of course, I got it.
He is. Yeah. And they gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So he got a preacher's daughter. And
Hey,
for
according
a
to
while.
James Butler,
Huh?
James Butler, he says, he's so funny when I teach him, you know James, Gilbert. He said, you know Joseph married Potiphar's niece. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, Potiphar.
So what
My third
nationality
grade
was
was-
she?
That was Potiphar's
Ken, do
niece.
you know?
Oh.
Egyptian.
And I wouldn't say that he's wrong. I don't know. He might be right.
What nationality is she? I mean, where is she
Priest of
from?
On.
Does anybody know?
Well, she's from Egypt. She's in
She's
Egypt.
Egyptian?
On is a city. Yeah. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt, and he was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. So,
Well, he didn't ask for a wife, but he gave him one, right?
yeah. So, just a little quick deal here. He's 17 years old when he comes in, when he comes into Egypt. He is 30 years old now that he's elevated to this position. So how long has he been in Egypt? 13 years he's been there. So you include the number of years that he was in Potiphar's house, which we don't know how many that
Right.
was. And then he was in jail for some period of time, and then we know that there were at least 2 years he was there, because he was there long enough to be recognized, which would have taken some time for the guy over the jail to recognize him and put him in that position. And then he served in that position for some years. And then after the dream, there was 2 more years. So now he's 30 years old. 30 years old. Anybody remember how old he is when he died? 110. 110. So he's gonna have a pretty good life. You know? I mean, he's got any car he wants to buy, any house he wants, anything that he wants, he's got it.
I think he's a remarkable man.
I think he's.
And he probably has servants
You
too.
know, I've thought about Joseph a lot. I mean, we think of David, we think of great leader Moses, Abraham. All of those were great leaders. They were sinful men. But it seems to me Joseph, you know, starting from a young man like you're talking about, sent into slavery and sold into slavery as a young boy, young man. And all the things he does, and his faithfulness is always there, no matter what he went through.
And you know, the thing is, you think of from 17 to 30, his life has been too much. Incredible.
Ups and downs.
His 20s were rough, weren't they? And so I did a little bit of calculating here. He spent 93 years of his 110 years life in Egypt. He was there for 93 years. And 80 of those years, he was second in command, assuming that he stayed second in command all that time. You know, that's just an assumption. But you think about his life as a whole, 17 years, 30 years, 110 years. And, you know, some of God's servants live in a palace. Some of God's servants live in a dungeon. And as we go through the prophets, you're going to see that even more. Some of them had a really, really good life. Some of them had a horrible, horrible life.
Even his first 17 years. I mean, his mother died and
In birth.
yeah, at birth, so he didn't have a mom, and then he had all of these other women in his life that were jealous of his mother, and and so the dad favored him probably because he had no mother, and so he was treated bad, I'm sure, by his brothers, by his stepmothers,
yeah.
by his stepmother's servants,
And kids.
and kids. So I mean, like, you don't have to have a perfect upbringing to do right.
But he had to have some kind of religious teaching to stay,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
you know, you got to give.
Well, his
Some
father, if
friend.
you go back and think about his father, you remember all the mess that started out with
Right.
Jacob and Esau, and then when God appeared to him at Bethel and made a covenant with him, and then when he came back, you know, he came back a rich man and so forth, so God had communicated with him directly, with his father, so his father, was a man of faith.
And had shared that faith.
Yeah.
And maybe shared it with him more than
Oh,
any of the rest of his
right,
sons,
because of his
because he was
relationship.
like, this is my,
I'm thinking he probably did.
He had one full brother,
Benjamin,
Benjamin. Rachel had 2 sons.
Jacob, and
One of them was born in Padan Aram, and the other one was born in the Promised Land. The
I
only
guess
one
he has
born.
mother for a little while. I wonder how, what's the difference?
yeah, I don't
So,
know if his age.
Benjamin kind of took Joseph's place in his father's mind, didn't he? So, anyway, we'll find out about that.
Yeah, which is why.
All right, we'll stop there. Next week, by the way, is eating meat, potluck.
Yeah, well, I know that he